Hello everyone, welcome back to The Wall Part 2. Uh, my host still hadn't come home by 7 o'clock. It seemed hardly likely now that they would be home before 8:30. So I fed the dog, ate my portion of risotto, and by the light of oil lamp read the newspapers that Hugo had brought with him. I grew sleepy in the warmth and the silence. Lynx had withdrawn into the stove door, where he panted quietly and contentedly. At 9, I decided to go to the bed. I locked the door and took the key with me to my room. I was so tired that I wanted to sleep immediately, despite the cold, damp quilt. I was awoken by the sun shining on my face, and immediately remembered the previous evening. As we had only one key to the lodge, and the henchman had the other one, Louise and Hugo would have had to wake me when they came back. I ran down the stairs in my dressing gown and unlocked the front door. Lynx welcomed me, whinnying impatiently, and dashed past me into the open. I went into the bedroom, although I was sure no one would be there, since the window was barred and Hugo couldn't have pushed his way through even an unbarred window. The beds, of course, were untouched. It was 8 o'clock. They must have stayed in the village. I was very surprised. Hugo couldn't stand the short beds in the inn, and he would never have been so inconsiderate as to leave me alone in the hunting lodge overnight. I could find no explanation for what had happened. I went back up to my bedroom and got dressed. It was still very cool, and the dew glistened on Hugo's black Mercedes. I made tea and warmed up a bit, and then set off towards the village with Lynx. I barely noticed how cool and dumb it was in the George, because I was brooding about what might have happened to the Rootlingas. Hugo might have had a heart attack, as always happens when you are dealing with hypochondriacs. We had stopped taking his condition seriously. I quickened my pace and sent Lynx on ahead. Braking cheerfully, he made off. I hadn't thought to put on my climbing boots, and stumbled clumsily along behind him over the sharp stones. When I finally reached the end of the gorge, I heard Lynx howling with pain and shock. I walked around a pile of logs that had been blocking my view, and there was Lynx, sitting wailing. Red saliva was dripping from his mouth. I bent over him and stroked him, trembling and whining. He pressed close to me. He must have been bitten his tongue or chipped a tooth. When I encouraged him to go on with me, he put his tail between his legs, stood in front of me, and pushed me back with his body. I couldn't see what he was so frightened of. At this point, the road emerged from the gorge, and as far as I could see, it lay deserted and peaceful in the morning sun. I reluctantly pushed the dog aside and went ahead on my own. Fortunately, thanks to Link's obstruction, I had slowed down for a few paces when I gave my head a violent bump and stumbled backwards. Lynx immediately started whining again and pressed himself against my legs. Baffled, I stretched out my hand and touched something smooth and cool, a smooth, cool resistance, where there could be nothing but air. I tentatively tried again, and once more my hand rested on something like a window pane. Then I heard a loud knocking sound and glanced around before realizing that it was my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. My heart had been frightened before I knew anything about it. I sat down on a tree trunk at the side of the road and tried to think. I couldn't. It was as if all my thoughts had abandoned me all at once. Lynx crept closer, and his bloody saliva dripped onto my coat. I stroked him until he calmed down, and then we both looked over to the road, so quiet and glistening in the morning light. I stood up there 3 more times and convinced myself that here, 3 yards from me, there really was something invisible, smooth and cold blocking my path. I thought it might be a hallucination, but of course, I knew that it was nothing of the kind. I could have coped much more easily with a momentary insanity than with this terrible invisible thing. But there was Lynx with his bleeding mouth, and there was the bump on my head, which was beginning to ache. I don't know how long I stayed sitting on a tree trunk, but I remember my thoughts kept hovering around quite trivial matters, as if they wanted to keep away at all cost from this incomprehensible experience. The sun rose higher and warmed my back. Linz licked and finally stopped bleeding. He couldn't have hurt himself too badly. I realized I had to do something and order Lynx to sit. Then I carefully approached the invisible obstruction with outstretched hands and felt my way along it until I bumped into the last rock of the gorge. I couldn't get any further on that side. On the other side of the road, I got as far as the stream, and only now did I notice that the stream was slightly dammed and was flooding its banks. Yet it wasn't carrying much water. It had been dry all April, and the snow had already thawed. On the other side of the wall, I have grown used to calling the thing the wall, because I had to give it some name or other noun that it was there. On the other side, then, the bed of the stream was almost dry, and then the water flowed on a trickle. It had obviously burrowed its way through the porous limestone, so the wall couldn't extend deep into the earth. A fleeting relief flashed through me. I didn't want to cross the blocked stream. There was no reason to believe that the wall suddenly stopped, because then it would have been easy for Hugo and Louise to get back. Suddenly I was struck by what might have been unconsciously worrying me the whole time. The fact that the road was entirely deserted. Someone would have raised the alarm ages ago. It would have been natural for the villagers to gather inquisitively behind the wall. Even if none of them had discovered the wall, Hugo and Louise would surely have bumped into it. The fact that there was not a single person to be seen struck me as even more puzzling than the wall. I began to shiver in the bright sunshine. The first little farmhouse, only a cottage in fact, was just around the next corner. If I crossed the stream and climbed up the mountain pasture a little, I would be able to see it. I went back to Linz and gave him a good talking to. He was very sensible, of course, and encouragement would have been much more appropriate. It was certainly a great source of comfort to me that I had Lynx with me. I took off my shoes and socks and waded through the stream. On the other side, the wall ran along the foot of the mountain pasture. At last I could see the cottage. It lay very still in the sunlight, a peaceful, familiar scene. A man stood by the spring, holding his right hand kept halfway between the flowing water and his face. A clean old man. His braces hang around him like snakes, and he had rolled up his shirt sleeves. But his hand didn't get to his face. He wasn't moving at all. I closed my eyes and waited, then looked again. The clean old man still stood motionless. I now saw that his knees and his gloved hand were resting on the edge of the stone through. Perhaps that was what stopped him falling over. Beside the house, there was a little garden in which herbs grew along with peonies and bleeding hearts. There was also a thin, tousled lilac bush that had already faded. It had been almost summery that April, even up here in the mountains. In the city, even the peonies had faded. No smoke rose from the chimney. I beat on the wall with my fist. It hurt a little, but nothing happened. And suddenly I no longer felt any desire to break down the wall separating me from the incomprehensible thing that had happened to the old man by the spring. Taking great care, I crossed the stream back to Linz, who was sniffing at something and seemed to have forgotten his fear. It was a dead nuthatch. It had his head caved in and its breast flecked with blood. That nuthatch was the first in the long succession of little bats that met their deaths so pitifully one radiant May morning. For some reason, I can never forget that nuthatch. While I was contemplating it, I noticed the plaintive cries of the bats. I must have been able to hear them for a long time before I was aware of them. All of a sudden, all I wanted was to leave that place and get back to the hunting lodge, away from the pitiful cries and the tiny blood-smeared corpses. Lynx too had grown worried again, and pressed himself winning against me. On the way back through the gorge, he stayed close by my side, and I spoke to him reassuringly. I can't remember what I said. It just seemed important to break the silence in the murky, damp gorge, where greenish light seeped through the beech tree leaves, and tiny streams trickled down from the bare rocks on my left. We were in a bad situation, Linz and I, and at the time we didn't know how bad it was. But we weren't lost entirely, because there were two of us. The hunting lodge now stood in bright sunshine. The dew on the Mercedes had dried, and the roof gleamed an almost reddish black. A few butterflies fluttered over the glade, and there was the sweet scent of warm spruce needles. I sat down on the bench, and immediately everything I had seen in the gorge seemed quite unreal. It simply couldn't be true. Things like that simply didn't happen. And if they did happen, then it wasn't in a little village in the mountains, not in Austria and not in Europe. I know how ridiculous that thought was, but as it is exactly what I was thinking, I won't deny it. I sat quite still in the sand and looked at the butterflies, and I don't think I really thought about anything for a while. Lynx, who had a drink at the spring, jammed up on the bench next to me and laid his hat on my lap. I was very pleased by this mark of favor, until it occurred to me that the poor dog didn't have any option. After an hour, I went into the lodge and heated up the rest of the risotto for Lynx and myself, and then made coffee to clear my head and smoked 3 cigarettes. They were my last cigarettes. Hugo, who was a very heavy smoker, had inadvertently taken 4 packs with him into the village in his coat pocket, and hadn't yet got around to laying in cigarette supplies for the aftermath of the next war. Over I had smoked the 3 cigarettes I couldn't bear in the house any longer, and went back to the George with Lynx. The dog followed me and enthusiastically and kept close to my heels. I ran almost the whole way, and came to a breathless halt when the wood pile appeared. Then I walked on with my hands outstretched until I touched the cool wall. Although I couldn't have expected anything different, the shock was much more violent this time than the time before. The stream was still blocked, but the trickle on the other side had grown a little wider. I took off my shoes and set about wading through the water. This time, Lynx followed me hesitantly and reluctantly. He wasn't afraid of water, but the stream was ice cold and went up to his belly. It unsettled me and that I couldn't see the wall. So I broke off an armful of hazel twigs and started sticking them in the earth along the wall. This activity struck me as the obvious thing to do, and most importantly, it kept me busy enough to stop me thinking. So I tidily staked out my twigs. My path now took me uphill a little way, and I got back to the spot from where I could see the little farmhouse. The old man was still standing by the spring, his capped hand raised to his face. The little bit of valley that I could see from here was filled with sunlight, and the air trembled, gold and green and clear, and the edges of the forest. Now Lynx could see the man too. He sat down, stretched his head into the air, and let out a drawn-out, terrible howling. He had understood that the thing by the spring was not a living human being. His howling tugged at me, and something within me tried to force me to howl along with him. It tugged at me as if it wanted to tear me to pieces. I took Lynx by his collar and pulled him away with me. He grew quiet and followed me, trembling. I slowly felt my way farther along the wall and stacked one piece of wood after the other into the ground. When I looked back, I was able to follow the new border down to the stream. It looked as if children had been playing there, a cheerful, harmless spring game. The fruit trees on the other side of the wall had already faded and were now covered with gleaming, light green leaves. From here on the wall rose gradually uphill to a group of larches in the middle of the mountain pasture. From here I could see two more cottages and part of the valley. I was annoyed that I had forgotten Hugo's binoculars. In any case, I couldn't see a single person, not a living soul. No smoke rose from the houses. The disaster must, by my reckoning, have happened towards evening and surprised the Redlingers when they were still in the village or on their own way home. If the man by the spring was dead, and I could no longer be in any doubt about that, then all the people in the valley must be dead. And not only the people, but everything that had been alive. Only the grass in the meadows lived now, the grass and the trees, the young leaves brilliant in the light. I stood, both palms pressed against the cool wall, and stared across. And suddenly I didn't want to see anything any more. I called Lynx, who had started digging under the larches, and went back, keeping to the little tribe boundary. After we had crossed the stream, I staked out the road as far as the rocks, and then slowly returned to the hunting lodge. After the cool, green gloom of the gorge, the scent suddenly overwhelmed us when we walked into the glade. Link seemed to have heard enough of the whole enterprise, ran into the house, and crept into the stove door. As ever, when he was at a loss, he went to sleep straight away after snuffling and wagging his tail for a bit. I envied him this ability. Now he was asleep, I missed the slight disturbance that he always emanated. but it was still better to have a sleeping dog in the house than to be entirely alone. Hugo, who didn't drink himself, had laid a little stone of cognac, gin, and whiskey. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat down at the big oak table. I had no intention of getting drunk. I was in desperate search of medicine to drive the dazed numbness from my head. It occurred to me that I thought of the whiskey as my whiskey, so that I no longer believe in the return of its rightful owner. This gave me something of a shock. After the third sip, I pushed the glass away disgusted. The drink tasted of straws soaked in Lysol. There was nothing in my head that I could make sense of. I had convinced myself that overnight an invisible world had come down or gone up. And in the state I was in, I was quite incapable of finding an explanation for it. I was neither concerned nor desperate, and there would have been no sense in forcing myself into either state. I was old enough to know that it would get me sooner or later. The most important question seemed to me to be whether only the valley or the whole country had been affected by this disaster. I decided to accept the former theory, since then I could still hope that I would be released from my forest prison in a few days. Today it seems to me that I hadn't believed in that possibility even then. But I'm not sure. In any case, I was sensible enough not to abandon hope at first. After a while, I noticed that my feet hurt. I took off my shoes and socks and saw that I had got blisters on my heels from walking. The pain seemed to me arrive at quite an opportune moment, because it distracted me from fruitless thoughts. After I had bathed my feet and smeared ointment on my heels and stuck plasters on them, I decided to organize the hunting lodge in the way that seemed most manageable. First of all, I moved Louis's bed out of the bedroom into the kitchen and put it behind the wall so that I could see the whole room and the door and the window. I spread Louis's sheepskin by the bed, in the secret hope that Lynx would choose to make its bed there. He didn't do this, incidentally, and went on sleeping in the stove door. I took the bedside table out of the bedroom as well. It was only some time later that I moved the wardrobe into the kitchen. I closed the shutters in the bedroom and then locked the door leading out of the kitchen. I locked the upper rooms as well and hung the keys on a nail beside the stove. I don't know why I did all these things. It must have been instinctive. I had to be able to see everything and protect myself against attack. I hung Hugo's loaded shotgun beside the bed and put the torch on the bedside table. I knew that all the measures I was taking were directed against human beings, and they struck me as ridiculous. But since I had only ever been threatened by human beings before, I couldn't adapt too quickly. The only enemy I had ever encountered in my life so far had been man. I brought up my traveling alarm clock and my watch, and then fetched wood, which lay stacked, cut, and chopped up under the veranda into the kitchen and piled it up beside the stove. Evening had fallen in the meantime, and the cool air swept down from the mountain into the house. The sunlight still lay upon the glade, but all the colors were slowly growing colder and harsher. A woodpecker was tapping in the wood. I was happy to hear it, and the splashing of the spring that flowed thick as my aim into the wooden trough. I laid my coat over my shoulders and sat on the bench. From there I could see the path into the George, the henchman's hut, the garage, and the dark spruce trees behind it. Sometimes I imagined I could hear footsteps in the George, but of course I was always mistaken. For a while, quite absently, I comprehend a few enormous wood ants passing by me in a hasty little procession. The woodpecker abandoned its tapping, the air grew cooler and cooler, and the light bluish and cold. The little patch of sky above my head turned pink. The sun had disappeared behind the spruce trees. The weather reported had been right. As I thought this I was reminded of the car radio. The window was half open, and I pressed the little black button. After a moment I heard a gentle, empty hum. The previous day, to my annoyance, Louise had listened to dance music throughout the journey. Now I would have collapsed with pleasure to hear a bit of music. I twisted and turned the buttons. Nothing but a distant, gentle hum that might only have come from the mechanism of the little box. I should have realized, even then, that I didn't want to. I preferred to convince myself that something in it must have broken during the night. I kept trying, and all that emerged from the box was that humming noise. I finally gave up and sat down on the bench again. Linz came out of the house and put his head on my lap. He needed attention. I talked to him, and he listened carefully and pressed himself against me, tail wagging. Finally he licked my hand and tentatively beat on the ground with his tail. We were both afraid, trying to give each other courage. My voice sounded strange and unreal, and I allowed it to drop to a whisper until I could no longer distinguish it from the splashing of the spring. The spring would often frighten me from a certain distance. Its splashing sounded like a conversation between two sleepy human voices. But I didn't know that as yet. Without noticing, I stopped whispering. I shivered under my wrap and watched the sky fade to gray. Finally, I went back to the hunting lodge and made a fire. I later saw that Lynx had gone to the George and stood there motionless, waiting. After a while he turned around and trotted back to the house, head lowered. He did this the following 3 or 4 evenings. Then he suddenly seemed to give up. I don't know if he just forgot, or if in his dog's way he realized the truth before I did. Thank you.